Welcome, fellow night owl, to tonight's peaceful journey through history. As you settle in for a restful night's sleep, I invite you to travel back to a time long ago, an age of chivalry and castles, where kings and queens ruled vast lands. From magnificently adorned thrones, before we begin our tale, I'd love to know where you are tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Feel free to leave a comment and share. It's always wonderful to see the diversity of this sleepy, history-loving community. If you enjoy these relaxing trips into the past, consider subscribing so you can always find peace and rest. Now, make yourself comfortable, dear friend. Perhaps you are snuggled beneath soft sheets or curled up on a cozy sofa. As your eyelids grow heavy and your breath slows, let my words carry you back through the centuries to an era both familiar and strange. We'll peek behind the stone walls of grand castles and into the lives of those who lived there. Tonight, we travel to medieval Europe, from the fall of Rome in the 5th century to the Renaissance blossoming in the 15th. This was a time of faith and superstition, of plagues and progress, of conquests and crusades. Over this ever-changing landscape were the monarchs, princes and princesses, kings and queens who asserted their divine right to rule by the grace of God. From bejeweled crowns to finely tailored cloaks, the royal trappings of the Middle Ages still capture our imaginations when we think of the rulers of old. It is easy to picture them in a haze of unimaginable wealth, forever feasting and dancing, hunting and hawking, waging war and seeking peace, draped in silks and adorned with jewels. But what was life really like for the royals of medieval Europe? How did they spend their days within the walls of sprawling castles and fortified manors? When they rested their crowned heads each night, what dreams and nightmares flickered behind their noble brows? As your head sinks into your pillow, I invite you to step into their embroidered slippers for a moment. Imagine you are a king or queen in the Middle Ages, born into a life of great privilege and power, yet also one bound by duty and tradition. Each choice will shape not just your fate, but the destiny of entire kingdoms. So join me now, dear listener, as we walk through echoing throne rooms and down torchlit hallways. Our footsteps are softened by thick rushes scattered across cold stone. We'll listen in on councils and ceremonies, feasts and festivals, births and betrothals. In doing so, we might discover that the royals of long ago were more human than the dusty history books suggest. Our first stop will be the royal bedchamber, that most private of spaces where monarchs began and ended each day. As you snuggle deeper into your own cozy nest, let's draw back the heavy velvet drapes and greet the dawn as they might have many centuries ago. Picture the first rays of sunlight streaming through an arrow-slit window, glinting off the golden threads of a finely crafted tapestry. A gently smoldering hearth fills the chamber with warmth, its flickering light dancing across the intricate carvings of a huge oak bed piled high with embroidered pillows and luxurious furs. All is quiet, except for the steady breathing of the noble sleepers within. Soon, a gentle knock at the door rouses the royal couple. It's the groom of the stool, that most intimate of courtiers, arriving to assist the king with his morning routines. With great ceremony, the monarch is washed, dried, and dressed in layer upon sumptuous layer. The queen is cared for by her ladies in waiting, each one a high-born beauty vying for her favor. Next comes prayer, as the king and queen are expected to set a virtuous example for their subjects. In a small private chapel, they kneel side by side to recite their morning devotions, the Latin phrases rolling off their tongues. The haze of incense and the shimmer of chalices create an almost dreamlike atmosphere, reminding them that their right to rule is a divine mandate, and even the mightiest must humble themselves before God. But amid all the ceremony and prayer, medieval monarchs also face more earthly concerns. So, fortified by their faith, the king and queen stepped out to confront a day filled with courtly duties and obligations. Despite their immense power and privilege, they were very much human, complete with all the follies, fears, and flaws that come with it. Their lives were shaped by both heavy responsibilities and lighthearted entertainments, by faith and politics. Perhaps no ruler better represented these contradictions than Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen in the 12th century. Born in 1122 to a wealthy and powerful family in France, Eleanor inherited a vast estate that encompassed nearly a third of the country. Beautiful, intelligent, and strong-willed, she became one of the most eligible women in Europe. In 1137, at just 15 years old, she married 17-year-old Prince Louis, the heir to the French throne. It was a prestigious match, but not a happy one. The scholarly and devout Louis was ill-suited for the spirited and worldly Eleanor. Nevertheless, when Louis's father died later that year, they became King Louis VI and Queen Eleanor of France. Despite their differences, Eleanor joined Louis on the Second Crusade in 1147, leading her contingent of Aquitanian soldiers. This bold move stirred controversy at the time. Crusading was seen as a male endeavor, thought to be the domain of men, not women. But Eleanor was no ordinary lady. Dressed in armor and mounted on a white horse, she made a striking figure on the march to the Holy Land. Unfortunately, like most crusades, it ended in disappointment. The Christian armies failed to retake Jerusalem and returned home in defeat. The crusade only deepened the divide between Eleanor and Louis. They had never been close, but now they could hardly stand each other. After 15 years of marriage and 2 daughters, the mismatched couple sought an annulment on grounds of being related by blood, which was a significant taboo for the church. In reality, it was a flimsy excuse to escape an unhappy marriage. The Pope granted the annulment in 1152, and at 30, Eleanor found herself single again. She didn't stay that way for long. Just 2 months after her annulment, Eleanor married the strapping young Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, an 18-year-old named Henry Plantagenet. It was a whirlwind romance and a smart political move. Their marriage combined Eleanor's lands with Henry's, creating a powerful counterbalance to the French crown. But that was just the beginning. When Henry's cousin, King Stephen of England, died in 1154, Henry claimed the English throne and became King Henry II, with Eleanor as his queen. Suddenly, the couple ruled a vast empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, the so-called Angevin Empire. Over the next 13 years, Eleanor gave Henry 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters, including future kings Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland, known from Magna Carta. However, not everything was perfect for the royal couple. Like in Eleanor's first marriage, her second was filled with conflict. Henry was a notorious womanizer, openly taking mistresses and fathering illegitimate children. He was also a domineering and often cruel husband, restricting Eleanor's movements and limiting her power. The fiercely independent Eleanor chafed at this treatment, and their marriage turned cold. Things escalated in 1173 when Eleanor's sons, encouraged by their mother, rebelled against Henry in a bid for power. It was the ultimate act of dynastic betrayal, but the revolt fizzled out, and Henry took his revenge. He captured Eleanor and imprisoned her for the next 16 years, locking her away in various royal castles. Her sons had little better luck. Henry's namesake, the young king, died of dysentery while leading a rebellion in 1183, and Geoffrey died in a jousting tournament in 1186. But time waits for no man, not even kings. When Henry died in 1189, Eleanor's favorite son, Richard, became king. One of his first acts was to release his long-suffering mother. At 67, Eleanor rode out of captivity and returned to power. With Richard often away on crusades, Eleanor served as regent, skillfully managing the realm and his ransom. When he was briefly held hostage, even in her later years, the indomitable Eleanor remained a force to be reckoned with. When Richard died in 1199, she backed her youngest son John's claim to the crown over his nephew Arthur. At 77, she led an army to lay siege to Arthur's supporters, ensuring the succession for John. She died in 1204 at the monastery of Fontevraud at the remarkable age of 82, an incredible lifespan for that time. In many ways, Eleanor of Aquitaine both reflected and defied the norms for medieval queens. She wielded great power and wealth, shaping the politics of her time through her marriages. But she also faced significant hardships, from an abusive husband to 16 years in prison. She was a woman who broke the mold and refused to be confined by society's expectations for her gender and status. A trendsetter and a trailblazer, a crusader, and a queen, a mother and a monarch, Eleanor's extraordinary life reads like an epic novel. Yet her story is not fiction. It is a testament to the complex realities faced by medieval royalty. The power and privilege, duty and domesticity, piety and politics all intertwined within the royal experience. Eleanor navigated these contradictions more than most, demonstrating savvy and resilience. Her legacy continues to influence historians and writers today. As we explore the lives of other notable rulers like Eleanor, we discover a rich tapestry of medieval monarchy. It reveals a world of lavish feasts and pious fasts, grand castles and even grander cathedrals, arranged marriages, and courtly love affairs. It was a world where reputation mattered and dynasty defined destiny. The crown was both a blessing and a burden, creating a reality that is both strangely alien and strikingly familiar. Perhaps that is why delving into the private lives of medieval kings and queens continues to fascinate us. It offers a glimpse into a lost world, revealing humanity behind the crowns and coronets. In their triumphs and struggles, their flaws and strengths, we see reflections of ourselves over the ages. In that sense, their stories become our stories, and their history becomes our heritage. As we wrap up our exploration of medieval royalty, let us reflect on the lessons their lives offer, the dangers of power, the burdens of privilege, the weight of expectation, and the enduring human capacity for resilience and reinvention. Have worn crowns and sat on thrones, they were still flesh and blood, still fallible and mortal, just like you and me. On that note, dear listener, it is time to say farewell to the gilded courts and candlelit halls of ages past. May your dreams be filled with visions of mighty castles, fair maidens, brave knights, and wise kings. May you awake refreshed, with a new appreciation for the royalty of old and the humanity in us all. Until next time, I bid you good night and sweet dreams. With the founding of the Order of the Garter, Edward III set a new standard for the pageantry and chivalric ideals that would come to define royal life in the late Middle Ages. This prestigious order of knighthood, with its elaborate ceremonies, grand feasts, and distinctive emblem of a blue garter, epitomized the pomp and majesty that medieval monarchs sought to cultivate. As we've seen, Edward and his queen, Philippa, presided over a splendid court culture at Windsor Castle, surrounding themselves with the greatest artists, poets, and musicians of the time. But amidst all the grandeur and revelry, medieval rulers were also expected to embody a deep and abiding piety. Religion filled every aspect of life in the Middle Ages, especially for monarchs who ruled by divine right. A king or queen was seen as God's anointed representative on earth, entrusted with leading their people in both matters of state and spiritual affairs. As such, medieval royalty were held to the highest standards of moral behavior and religious devotion. A typical day for a medieval monarch began with morning mass in their lavish private chapel, attended by a group of priests and clerics. Kings and queens spent long hours in prayer, offering supplications for the well-being of their realm and the salvation of their immortal souls. The Book of Hours, a richly illuminated devotional text, was a prized possession for many royals who pored over its gilded pages in quiet contemplation. The religious calendar also dictated much of the rhythm of courtly life. The liturgical year was marked by a series of holy feasts and fasts that all members of the royal household were expected to observe. Lent, in particular, saw the royal diet restricted to very simple meatless meals in emulation of Christ's 40 days in the wilderness. During the grand celebrations of Christmas and Easter, the piety and majesty of medieval monarchy reached their fullest expression. The king or queen presided over magnificent ceremonies in the great cathedrals, wearing their finest regalia and crowns. Amid clouds of incense and the chants of mass choirs, they took communion before their assembled subjects, affirming their role as the ultimate spiritual authority in the land. This public display of piety was immensely important for cultivating the aura of holiness and righteousness that medieval rulers relied on to legitimize their earthly power. By publicly venerating saintly relics, endowing monasteries and churches, and even embarking on holy pilgrimages and crusades, kings and queens reinforced their image as the godly stewards of Christian society. Perhaps no one embodied this ideal of the pious medieval monarch more fully than Louis IX of France, known to history as St. Louis. Renowned for his devout faith and austere lifestyle, Louis regularly fasted and wore a hair shirt under his royal robes as a sign of penance. He even invited the poor to eat at his table. He embarked on 2 ultimately disastrous crusades to the Holy Land, dying of dysentery on the second venture in Tunisia. However, his reputation for holiness only grew, and he was canonized by the Catholic Church just 27 years after his death. Of course, not all medieval rulers lived up to such lofty ideals. For every St. Louis, there was a king like Henry VIII of England, who famously broke with the Catholic Church to divorce his first wife and went on to marry 5 more times. The notorious Pope Alexander VI, who reigned during the Renaissance, openly acknowledged his illegitimate children and was accused of turning the Vatican into a den of vice. But for most medieval monarchs, piety and prayer remained essential parts of their daily lives and public personas in an age when the line between the sacred and the secular was indeed thin. Kings and queens were expected to bridge that divide, serving as both temporal and spiritual leaders for their people. It was a heavy responsibility that could weigh on even the most devout rulers. The great Carolingian emperor Charlemagne, who ruled much of Western Europe in the 8th and 9th centuries, was said to have wept with emotion as he took communion on his deathbed. He felt the weight of his sins and the enormity of his role as God's representative on earth. For the medieval monarchs who bore this sacred mantle, the glittering trappings of royal life, sumptuous banquets, silk-draped beds, and fawning courtiers, were perhaps welcome distractions from the heavy matters of the soul that occupied so many of their waking hours. In the flickering candlelight of the royal chapel, as the king or queen knelt in prayer before the altar, the outside world with its earthly cares and pleasures must have seemed very far away. As we reflect on these long-ago rulers in their private moments of prayer, we are reminded of the deeply human side of even the most exalted lives. Behind the crowns and scepters, the fine robes and soaring speeches, medieval monarchs grappled with the same timeless questions that have always troubled the human heart: questions of meaning, mortality, and the desire for connection with the divine filled the quiet spaces of great cathedrals where kings and queens worshipped. In the dim shadows of their bedrooms, they sought comfort and guidance from a higher power. This pursuit left us a strong reminder of the lasting search for purpose and transcendence that connects us all through the ages. However, even the most devout rulers could not spend all their time in prayer and reflection. The responsibilities of ruling a kingdom demanded their attention. Medieval monarchs navigated a tricky world of competing interests, shifting alliances, and strong personalities as they tried to maintain their power. One ruler who exemplified the shrewd political skills and strong character needed for success in the medieval era was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born into a wealthy noble family in southwestern France in 1122, Eleanor was among the most sought-after bachelorettes in Europe when she inherited the vast duchy of Aquitaine at just 15. Her first marriage to the pious King Louis VII of France turned out to be a poor match. The worldly and cultured Eleanor found the reserved Louis dull, and their relationship worsened after she joined him on the disastrous Second Crusade to the Holy Land. Rumors circulated that Eleanor had an affair with her uncle, the charming Raymond of Poitiers, while they were camped near the Great Walls of Antioch. When the royal couple returned to France, their marriage was effectively over. In a surprising move for the time, the Pope granted Louis an annulment due to their close relation. At just 28 years old, Eleanor suddenly became the most desirable bride in Christendom again. Her next marriage would carry significant consequences. Just 8 weeks after the annulment, Eleanor married the young Duke of Normandy, Henry Plantagenet, who controlled vast lands in western France. 2 years later, Henry became King Henry II of England, with Eleanor as his queen. Together, they ruled an expansive empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees Mountains, covering all of England and more than half of modern-day France. This realm was among the largest and most powerful in medieval Europe, centered on the partnership of Henry and Eleanor. Throughout their tumultuous 35-year marriage, the couple had 8 children, including 2 future kings of England, the legendary Richard the Lionheart and his treacherous brother John. Eleanor served as regent for her sons when they became kings, wielding great power and influence herself. However, her rise to become one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe was not easy. Eleanor and Henry's marriage was marked by infidelities, power struggles, and outright rebellion from their sons, often with Eleanor's support. In 1173, Eleanor's 3 eldest sons, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, rebelled against their father in a bid for more control over their territories. Eleanor, who felt restricted by Henry's attempts to limit her power, sided with her sons. Unfortunately, the rebellion was defeated, and Eleanor was captured while trying to flee to France. Furious, Henry imprisoned her, placing her under house arrest for the next 16 years. It wasn't until Henry's death in 1189 that Eleanor was finally freed by her son Richard, now King of England. Despite being nearly 70 years old, she quickly regained her political influence. When Richard departed for the Third Crusade shortly after his coronation, Eleanor acted as regent, governing England firmly. She outlived both Richard and John, passing away in 1204 at the impressive age of 82. Eleanor's long and eventful life provides a captivating look at the complexities of power and gender in the medieval world. As a woman of great influence, wealthy heiress, queen consort, regent, and mother of kings, she defied many constraints of her gender in a patriarchal society. Still, her story highlights the vulnerabilities that even powerful women faced. As she remained subject to the will of the men around her, first her husbands, then her sons. Her imprisonment at Henry's hands illustrates the limits of female power in a world dominated by kings. Yet, Eleanor's lasting appeal for historians and storytellers indicates that her legacy goes beyond royal status or gender constraints. In many ways, she embodies the restless spirit of her time and era, when the old feudal structures were shifting toward the new ideals of courtly romance and individualism. As a patron of the arts and a leader of the courts of love where courtly romance was celebrated, Eleanor helped shape the cultural ideals that define the High Middle Ages. Her influence appears in everything from the love poetry of the troubadours to the magnificent cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts that still inspire us today. In this story, we follow a woman who struggled with the major issues of her time: power, faith, love, and duty. She left a lasting mark on the world around her. Her tale is one of ambition and intrigue, passion and politics, and the challenge of asserting oneself in a world often unkind to strong-willed women. Ultimately, it is a deeply human story. It reminds us that even the most prominent figures in history were real people with flaws and weaknesses. In the flickering candlelight of an ancient castle chamber, we can picture Eleanor in a rare moment of rest, a woman of strong spirit and sharp intelligence, yet still wanting and vulnerable in ways that resonate with the human experience. As we fall asleep, let's dream of Eleanor and her world. It was a place of crenellated battlements, fluttering banners, soaring cathedrals, and fragrant gardens, filled with love, war, and the endless power struggles. We should also remember that the grand narrative of history is woven from the countless individual lives, each one a story waiting to be told, and a legacy waiting to be honored. In the quiet of the night, we see that the lives of medieval monarchs were filled with extravagance and show, but also tightly bound by strict expectations and heavy responsibilities. Despite the splendor of their castles and courts, kings and queens led daily lives that were often far from enviable. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example. Born into wealth and power as the heir to a large duchy, she became Queen of France at just 15 when she married King Louis VI. The young couple set out on the ill-fated Second Crusade, a grueling journey that ended in military defeat and personal separation. After 15 years of marriage and the birth of 2 daughters, Eleanor and Louis, their union was annulled based on consanguinity. However, Eleanor's story continued. Just 8 weeks later, she married the young Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who soon became King Henry II of England. As queen once more, Eleanor became a strong political player. She governed England as regent during Henry's long absences and bore him 8 children, including future kings Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. Yet, despite her power, Eleanor's life was tumultuous and constrained by the politics of her time. Tensions grew in her marriage to Henry, and she eventually urged her sons to revolt against him, a move that led to her spending 16 years under house arrest. In the end, she outlived both her husbands and all but 2 of her 10 children, passing away at 82. As the queen mother and one of the remarkable survivors of her era, Eleanor's incredible story shows the precarious position even noble women occupied, often subjected to the authority of fathers, husbands, and sons. Queens could hold significant power from behind the scenes, but they always risked punishment for going too far. The personal was deeply political, and a royal woman's choice of spouse or ability to bear heirs could mean the difference between dynastic triumph and failure. This was also true for Empress Matilda, the daughter of England's King Henry I. Groomed for greatness from an early age, Matilda was married off to the Holy Roman Emperor as a teenager and later returned to England to become her father's heir after her brother died in a shipwreck. However, the barons resisted accepting a woman as their ruler, and when Henry died, Matilda's cousin Stephen rushed to claim the throne, igniting nearly 20 years of civil war known as the Anarchy. Matilda fought hard for what she believed was her birthright, gathering troops and even escaping a besieged castle by being lowered down the walls in a coffin. She came incredibly close to the crown, entering London in triumph and preparing for her coronation, but the fickle citizens soon turned against her, leading to her expulsion from the city. Ultimately, Matilda had to accept seeing her son, the future Henry II, recognized as Stephen's successor. This was a diplomatic solution to England's chaos, but a personally disappointing outcome for a woman who had worked so hard to claim the throne for herself. The stories of Eleanor and Matilda remind us of the limitations medieval women faced. Even at the highest levels of society, queens and empresses could acquire wealth and hold influence, but their agency always depended on the tolerance of the men around them. In a world where martial strength was the ultimate source of authority, female rulers were only regents or intermediaries, never truly secure on their thrones. Despite the political barriers, medieval royal women often found other ways to channel their ambitions. Many took on significant roles as patrons of the arts, commissioning stunning works to beautify their palaces and commemorate their legacies. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a well-known supporter of troubadours and poets, presiding over a vibrant court culture that helped shape the early medieval fascination with courtly love. Other queens engaged more actively in the religious life of their kingdoms, founding abbeys and monasteries, going on pilgrimages, and even leading crusades as Eleanor did with her first husband. In this story, we follow a woman who struggled with the major issues of her time: power, faith, love, and duty. She left a lasting mark on the world around her. Her tale is one of ambition and intrigue, passion and politics, and the challenge of asserting oneself in a world often unkind to strong-willed women. Ultimately, it is a deeply human story. It reminds us that even the most prominent figures in history were real people with flaws and weaknesses. In the flickering candlelight of an ancient castle chamber, we can picture Eleanor in a rare moment of rest, a woman of strong spirit and sharp intelligence, yet still wanting and vulnerable in ways that resonate with the human experience. As we fall asleep, let's dream of Eleanor and her world. It was a place of crenellated battlements, fluttering banners, soaring cathedrals, and fragrant gardens, filled with love, war, and the endless power struggles. We should also remember that the grand narrative of history is woven from the countless individual lives, each one a story waiting to be told, and a legacy waiting to be honored. In the quiet of the night, we see that the lives of medieval monarchs were filled with extravagance and show, but also tightly bound by strict expectations and heavy responsibilities. Despite the splendor of their castles and courts, kings and queens led daily lives that were often far from enviable. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example. Born into wealth and power as the heir to a large duchy, she became Queen of France at just 15, when she married King Louis VI. The young couple set out on the ill-fated Second Crusade, a grueling journey that ended in military defeat and personal separation. After 15 years of marriage and the birth of 2 daughters, Eleanor and Louis, their union was annulled based on consanguinity. However, Eleanor's story continued. Just 8 weeks later, she married the young Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who soon became King Henry II of England. As queen once more, Eleanor became a strong political player. She governed England as regent during Henry's long absences and bore him 8 children, including future kings Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. Yet, despite her power, Eleanor's life was tumultuous and constrained by the politics of her time. Tensions grew in her marriage to Henry, and she eventually urged her sons to revolt against him, a move that led to her spending 16 years under house arrest. In the end, she outlived both her husbands and all but 2 of her 10 children, passing away at 82. As the Queen Mother and one of the remarkable survivors of her era, Eleanor's incredible story shows the precarious position even noblewomen occupied, often subjected to the authority of fathers, husbands, and sons. Queens could hold significant power from behind the scenes, but they always risked punishment for going too far. The personal was deeply political, and a royal woman's choice of spouse or ability to bear heirs could mean the difference between dynastic triumph and failure. This was also true for Empress Matilda, the daughter of England's King Henry I. Groomed for greatness from an early age, Matilda was married off to the Holy Roman Emperor as a teenager and later returned to England to become her father's heir after her brother died in a shipwreck. However, the barons resisted accepting a woman as their ruler, and when Henry died, Matilda's cousin Stephen rushed to claim the throne, igniting nearly 20 years of civil war known as the Anarchy. Matilda fought hard for what she believed was her birthright, gathering troops and even escaping a besieged castle by being lowered down the walls in a coffin. She came incredibly close to the crown, entering London in triumph and preparing for her coronation, but the fickle citizens soon turned against her, leading to her expulsion from the city. Ultimately, Matilda had to accept seeing her son, the future Henry II, recognized as Stephen's successor. This was a diplomatic solution to England's chaos, but a personally disappointing outcome for a woman who had worked so hard to claim the throne for herself. The stories of Eleanor and Matilda remind us of the limitations medieval women faced. Even at the highest levels of society, queens and empresses could acquire wealth and hold influence, but their agency always depended on the tolerance of the men around them. In a world where martial strength was the ultimate source of authority, female rulers were only regents or intermediaries, never truly secure on their thrones. Despite the political barriers, medieval royal women often found other ways to channel their ambitions. Many took on significant roles as patrons of the arts, commissioning stunning works to beautify their palaces and commemorate their legacies. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a well-known supporter of troubadours and poets, presiding over a vibrant court culture that helped shape the early medieval fascination with courtly love. Other queens engaged more actively in the religious life of their kingdoms, founding abbeys and monasteries, going on pilgrimages, and even leading crusades as Eleanor did with her first husband. And her harsh rule pushed away erstwhile allies. A popular uprising forced Matilda to flee London before her planned coronation. As the war dragged on, the people suffered greatly from the breakdown in law and order. In the end, neither Matilda nor Stephen would actually win. The chaos ended in 1153 with the Treaty of Winchester, which allowed Stephen to keep the throne but named Matilda's young son Henry as his successor. The following year, Stephen's death allowed Henry II to restore stability to England. Matilda's long struggle for her royal inheritance was finally over. The dramatic story of the Empress Matilda shows that even those born into privilege can face political turmoil. Matilda was born into power and raised for greatness, but her gender and strong personality ultimately hindered her path to the crown. While she never ruled in her own right, Matilda's lifelong quest for the throne laid the groundwork for the Plantagenet dynasty, which would dominate England for over 300 years. Throughout the Middle Ages, royals like Matilda were expected to promote culture and learning for their people, in a time when education was mostly available to the wealthy and religious orders. Medieval monarchs played a significant role in advancing the arts and sciences. Kings and queens used their vast resources to support the work of scholars and artisans, demonstrating their power and prestige. Few things showcased a ruler's cultural influence, like commissioning grand works of architecture, soaring cathedrals, and imposing castles served as impressive tributes to both god and monarch. The Gothic style flourished from the 12th to the 16th centuries. It featured pointed arches, flying buttresses, intricate sculptures, and beautiful stained glass technical marvels that required teams of skilled masons, glass workers, and artisans. Take, for example, France's Chartres Cathedral, which was primarily built between 1194 and 1250 under Philip II, Louis VI, and Louis IX. Its towering 112-foot stone-vaulted ceiling, 176 stained glass windows, and ornate royal portal were all remarkable innovations for that period. Up to 300 artisans likely worked continuously over decades to create this Gothic masterpiece. Equally impressive were the projects royals commissioned for their residences. Sprawling palaces and fortified castles were built and expanded over centuries, with each generation of rulers adding their own elements. The famous Palace of Westminster in London started as a modest 11th century home for Anglo-Saxon kings. By the time Richard II began rebuilding it in 1394, the palace featured a magnificent Great Hall, separate royal apartments, and defensive walls surrounding over 10 acres along the river. Inside their grand homes, medieval monarchs surrounded themselves with beauty. Tapestries were the ultimate status symbol. They were incredibly expensive to create and added warmth, color, and storytelling to cold stone halls. Kings from Charlemagne to Henry VIII collected vast arrays of ornate tapestries, like the 14th century Apocalypse series, stretching 472 feet. Illuminated manuscripts, paintings, frescoes, silk cushions, and silver plate completed the lavish decor. However, royal support extended well beyond the visual arts. Poets, playwrights, and musicians found fame and fortune at court. Rulers sponsored extravagant performances and competitions, hiring the finest creators of the day as official court composers. One could trace the development of secular music through figures like Guillaume de Machaut, who served John the Blind, King of Bohemia, in the 1300s. One of the most enduring types of cultural support by medieval monarchs was the establishment of universities and libraries. Starting in the 1100s, a ruler's prestige became linked to the scholars they attracted and the institutions they funded. The universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and the Sorbonne all had royal patrons. Vast collections, accumulated in places like the Library of the Louvre, made Paris a center of learning. By supporting the spread of knowledge, royals aimed to glorify both God and their own reputations. Of course, not all cultural endeavors were so noble. Entertaining the court was a major focus, and some rulers became famous for their lavish festivities, lasting several days. One notorious event was the Ball of the Burning Men, hosted by the French Queen Isabel of Bavaria in 1393. During this wild masquerade, King Charles VI and several lords dressed as wild men in costumes of linen soaked in resin for an authentic look. When the king's brother approached with a torch, their flammable outfits ignited. Several men died, though the king was saved by the quick actions of his young aunt. This gruesome incident was seen as an ill omen, foreshadowing Charles VI's later bouts of madness. Despite such tragedies, the cultural legacy left by medieval royalty is undeniable. This period marked a blossoming of creativity and learning, with rulers leading as patrons. By commissioning grand buildings, art, and centers of knowledge, kings and queens hoped to achieve a kind of immortality beyond their own reigns. For us today, looking back through the centuries, these tangible remnants of royal lives help bring a long-gone era into clearer view. While it's easy to romanticize the pageantry and luxury of medieval royalty, there was much more to their reigns.